Hi, everyone. My name is Thomas Mulligan, and I'm a consulting editor for Semper. And I'm very pleased to be here today hosting the next installment of Semper Curious's Colloquia series, in which we sit down with a distinguished scholar to discuss his or her area of research. And I'm happy today to be joined by Ben Glaser. Ben is an assistant professor of English at Yale University. He received his bachelor's in English from NYU, went on to do his master's and PhD at Cornell, graduated in 2012, and his research concerns the history and practice of prosody. Ben, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So Ben, we chatted a little bit last week. I wasn't aware of the term prosody before we spoke then. So let's start there. What is prosody? Why do you study it?
So what is prosody? Most broadly, it would be the forms taken by sound in language. So in language or in literature, and especially for me, in poetry, which is the domain where most people are primarily interested in sound, which is not to say that, we don't care about sound elsewhere, but poetry is, foregrounds it. So you could contrast the study of prosody with, say, thinking about meaning or interpretation or content or even grammar, but you don't really have to. But those are some of the ways you could think about, just the sound form. In linguistics, which, prosody is really important. It usually refers to a number of different domains in which sound can be organized. From the syllable, there are different parts to a syllable. You might study the prosody of it, all the way up to, say, the intonational phrase, which is how we contour our voice to help people understand it. So if you say, does it? Or you could then respond by saying, it does, or it does, right? We're always using prosody in our speech, and then it gets formalized, I would say, in really interesting ways in poetry. Why do I study it? I don't know. Maybe I just love listening and thinking about the ordering of sound as an aesthetic.
And what is it about poetry that makes prosody so important or so apt?
I think in one way to understand this, when we're going about our daily business and trying to communicate things, we use things like intonation and pitch and all these sound elements primarily in the service of communication, right? In order to make our meaning well understood. If you flip that around, I think in poetry, the sound is kind of there for its own sake. And I love the fact that we're in this realm where, yeah, meaning matters, right? Poems are in sentences, they say things, but these poets, they often hear a rhythm first and they want to get that sound down. It brings poetry closer to music, although I don't want to overstress that. Poetry is its own thing, but there's certainly this kind of pleasing repetition of sounds that gets organized in dynamic ways in poetry, and it matters a lot more to poets, I would say, than it does to, say, prose stylists.
Thinking about music, we have this notion of harmony. Is it the same in poetry where there's a prosody that sort of fits with the meaning of a poem, and you have to make sure the two are appropriate for each other? Is that something poets think about, for example?
I think they definitely think about it, but it's rare that you have like a one-to-one correspondence between, say, a certain form. So famously, Shakespeare writes in iambic pentameter. Yeah. I'll explain iambic later, but pentameter would be 5 iambic units, 10 syllables. And it's a little bit easier to capture dramatic speech in that than in other forms. Okay, so it's more fitting to that. Rhyme, if you have rhyming lines, that is conducive to certain thoughts, parallel thoughts, for example, are nicely, they work nicely if you have 2 rhymes that can put those thoughts together. So I think locally it does work that way, but broadly, I would say probably not. It's not like there is a certain form. You get broad period styles. So like, Homer wrote in his epic verse in dactylic hexameter. It was the epic meter. And we can talk more about that, but it's not because it meant anything in particular. It just really worked for the language to allow him to do what he wanted to do.
And, I know we're going to talk about meter a bit more, but what are some other elements of prosody? So what would be familiar to the people watching?
Right. So yeah, meter is probably the biggest, and I'm glad we'll focus on it, the biggest component, but really anytime you have sound that can be organized, which is to say that can repeat. you might be talking about prosody. So alliteration is a really good example. From the, so a famous example, alliteration or assonance, which is, assonance is when the vowels occur again and again, and alliteration is usually when the consonants occur again and again. So there's a famous political slogan, "I like Ike," that is famous. Once you're kind of saying "I like Ike," kind of your I is a part of Ike, and you like him because Ike is a part of like, and you get this kind of parallelism between the sounds I that kind of weaves it all together. So that's prosody, right? That's the prosody of that phrase, and that's not really about meter at all. It's about sound patterns. What are some other elements? I think the repetition of sound and things like alliteration is paramount. Rhyme is of course an example of repetition of sound. We usually think of rhyme happening at the ends of lines. I'd say rhyme and meter are the main things to keep in mind, but you can think about rhyme happening anywhere in the line. Internal rhyme, in hip hop, for example, you get a ton of rhyming close nearby, the other rhyme words, not just at the ends of lines. I'd say rhyme is another big. Yeah.
In thinking about the slogan, the "I like Ike," I mean, it seems like two things are going on. One, you said that was assonance. Is that an example of assonance?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or rhyme, kind of the same, right?
Okay.
Internal rhyme or assonance are the same thing. Yeah.
And so I think, when I think about that, one thing, it makes it catchy. So you remember the slogan, okay, "I like Ike," but it also kind of has a better visceral impact, it seems. So you don't just remember it, but it sticks in there in a more powerful way than something that's memorable, maybe without the pleasing rhyme.
So there are always these interesting moments in the history of poetry where people get really skeptical about rhyme because they think it's like either too easy or too powerful or cheap or what's the word, like kind of infiltrates your mind. It's kind of like advertising in the poem. So Milton famously said he saw it as a bondage, but it also felt cloying. Then other poets are like, no, we're going to bring this back in really interesting ways. So there's always this kind of ebb and flow. But you can see how you don't want to like Eisenhower because his nickname rhymes with like. That's not a great reason to like a president, but there it is, right? And so, poets are always kind of playing with this powerful prosodic element of language.
Yeah, that's interesting. Maybe we'll return to this, but I mean, is it fair to say you're a bit of an evangelist for prosody, whereas maybe some scholars are more skeptical of its use or its appropriateness? You are not, or is it widely understood to be really core, important element of poetry even today?
So that's a really interesting. Am I an evangelist? I am definitely an evangelist for thinking about prosody, and the easiest reason to say we got to study this is that every poet is obsessed with it. You go through poets' statements about their poetry, and they always talk about hearing a tune or trying to catch these sounds and get them into words, and they're always writing, depending on the period of time, essays about it. So that's easy. The harder thing is that I'm also really into meter, but I don't really care if people like contemporary poets write in certain meters, and that because I think that's a different matter. That's a kind of prescriptive thing. Like I'm not telling anyone what meter they ought to write in, but I do want people to notice the meter, because once they do, they're kind of on the right level with the poet. They're kind of starting where the poet wants them to start, at the risk of investing too much in what poets want. We should all read the way we want, but I think knowing about the meter gives us a really powerful way to get at the feelings for language that the poet themselves wants.
So meter is really fundamental then.
Depending on the time period, yes. I would, yeah.
Well, let's talk about that then. Let's talk a little bit more about meter. I know we have an example of a poem that we'll go over, but could you just maybe take a minute to talk to me in a bit more detail about meter, what it is, and some of the things it can do in a poem?
So, sometimes when you teach a class on meter, you might go through a lot of different meters, and there are different meters, but there is a dominant meter in English, and that dominant meter is iambic meter, or sometimes called duple meter. Basically, you have an unstressed syllable and a stressed syllable, and that's a kind of basic pattern. So if you take the word America and put it, two in a row, America, America, you can start to hear it pretty quickly. That why is that so powerful in meter? Why is it so common? And the reason lies in the prosody of our language. Different languages have different, different phonologies, different prosodies. Our language really cares about stress, English, German too, but not say French or, which is more about, is a syllabic language and doesn't, there is stress, but it's not quite as profound. So to give an example, I'm trying to think of there are words that take on different meanings when you shift the stress around. I'm trying to think of one. I'm blanking completely right now.
What about like a record and record?
There you go. Right. So that is it a noun or a verb? Thank you. We know that based on where the stress is. So that means that our brains are really cued into stress. We need it, and we know when we know a word, we know what it means. We also know where its stresses are, and that's actually part of it, how it lives in our brain. And this is something linguists know. Okay, so once you have stress, let's say you want to make a pattern out of it. Okay, well, our language also has this preference for not putting stresses next to each other. So if you say 14, you might say 14. It's kind of hard to know where the stress is. If I say, 14 kids, the stress starts to subtly move towards 14 kids instead of 14 kids. It's a little hard to hear it, but we have this thing called the rhythm rule. We will actually shift stresses around as we're speaking so that they alternate. Okay, we just do that whether we're writing poetry or not. So poets, like the tradition of iambic poetry over the last 400 years or so has refined that so that there is this kind of preference, a sort of normative preference towards alternating stress. The boy stood on the burning deck. The curfew tolls the knell of parting day. To be or not to be, right? You get almost everything, right? And it can get a little ham-fisted if you start doing it like that. But there's just a preference, and so it's once you know that that's a preference, you have a sense of meter, and then you can explore all of the different rhythms that get created. There are other meters. I don't know. So there are triple meters, anapestic or dactylic meters. So those would have two not stressed syllables followed by a stress syllable. So the famous example from Byron is, the Assyrian came down like a wolf on the fold, and so on. And you probably memorized.
Well, it almost sounds like a waltz or a tempo in music.
Yeah, so that's exactly it. It sounds not quite like language. It sounds a bit more like a musical rhythm. And that's why it doesn't appear so often. Poets don't really want to be playing kind of a hurdy-gurdy all the time. Sure. There are other meters that are like trochaics, where you have the stress and then the unstressed. And the most famous example of that by far is one that any Midwesterner born in the, say like 30s through, maybe 60s would know, which is the Song of Hiawatha by Longfellow. By the shores of Gitche-Gumee, by the waters ever flowing. Same problem, right? It's really, you hear it really fast. Yeah. Whereas the poem I'm going to share in a second, it's an iambic and it's subtle. You can be subtle in iambic first. Then there are some other meters, but if we have time, we can talk about them.
Good. So then, what are we going to read today?
Let's look at. So we're going to look at 4 lines. We'll read the whole poem, but 4 lines from the end of W.B. Yeats's poem, "An Irish Airman Foresees His Death," and then just one line from The Second Coming, but I'll explain why. And I'll share. Let me share the poem. Why did I choose this poem? Well, before I even get into it, I'll share it so you can see it while I talk about it. This is an iambic tetrameter, which means it's got 4 iambic feet. Leaving whether they're really feet or not is kind of beside the point, but it's important. There are 4 of these units. I know that I shall meet my fate. Okay, it's a very simple meter, and it's probably the most common meter in English. It's, every ballad, every hymn, a lot of nursery rhymes are kind of based around this simple 4-beat line. So he's writing it in a really simple meter, and it's a poem. So there's that. So it's immediately apparent. What else about this poem? What I guess I'll read it aloud, and what I want you to notice is, that there is this cadence that is there and repeated, but also this is a poem about stoicism. This is a soldier who, as we learn in the 5th and 6th, or sorry, the 3rd and 4th line, doesn't hate those he fights. He doesn't love those he guards. He's not part of any one nation exactly, and his feelings are he's really kind of literally above it all. And the meter, by the end of this poem, the meter embodies that kind of stoical distance from the immediacy. It becomes a kind of abstract pattern that we can associate with his state of mind. And so he he chose this meter and he designed the meter as a way to get at that feeling.
Okay.
But that's easier to see when with I can show that a little better later. But I guess, try to listen to the regularity of the cadence as I read it.
Okay.
I know that I shall meet my fate somewhere among the clouds above. Those that I fight, I do not hate. Those that I guard, I do not love. My country is Kiltartan cross. My countrymen Kiltartans poor. No likely end could bring them loss, or leave them happier than before. Nor law nor duty bade me fight, nor public man, nor cheering crowds. A lonely impulse of delight drove to this tumult in the clouds. I balanced all, brought all to mind. The years to come seemed waste of breath, a waste of breath the years behind, in balance with this life, this death. I'll stop sharing for a minute. You might be wondering, how do you know where the stresses are when you're performing a poem, all that? It really comes down to doing what you want, I think, with some limits. There are some rules. But, you think about the language, you think about what the poem is saying, and you put the stresses where you want. The meter is going to be there either way. I think that's the one thing to take away. How we perform the poem can enhance our sense of the meter. I tried a little bit there, but the meter is just there. It's just underneath and behind every line. Much as the airman's kind of existence or sense of like his self is behind any incidental thing that might happen to him in his life. So, yeah. Yeah,
you mentioned Stoicism. I mean, no question about it. There's a definite stoical element coming through there. And, the regimentation, so this you said is iambic tetrameter, yeah? And so, I mean, there is a regimentation. I mean, you almost, at least I almost got the sense of like a drum cadence or something, almost like a bit of a march, like the guy's doing his duty. And so I could see how it comes out through the sounds a little bit. And that, duty, of course, is a core stoical element.
Yeah, right, exactly. And I think, the fact that everything kind of repeats, those that I fight, those that I guard, that repetition becomes a way of balancing, different possible emotions or passions, and actually letting the balance or the equation between them become the primary, feeling he has, or the primary mode of his existence. I think it's kind of hard to hold on to. Probably in the middle of World War I, it's probably hard to hold a stoical position, I would imagine. And so,
maybe it's the only thing that can get you through it.
Right.
So this, yeah, of course, Yeats was Irish, and so this would be an Irishman fighting on behalf of maybe the British.
Right.
I got it. Okay. Well,
and Yeats had a very.
I'm sorry.
So I was just going to say Yeats had a very complicated relationship to national politics in general. So it kind of makes sense that he would return to sound patterns. I mean, it can sound like an escape from politics, but it can also be a return to politics. So it's quite complicated there, but he's thinking through the meter, I guess, is what just in general.
And can you show us a little bit of the meter in this poem?
I can try. Let's see. Okay. Bear with me for one moment. So feel free, please pause me as I'm speaking. If anything, this is a quick meter lesson. This is the 5-minute version of something that could be longer. But so I've given the last 4 lines of this poem, and what I want to show everyone first. Oh, I got 1 second. Okay. Okay. Sorry about that. So first we need to know, where are the stresses? We need to start off by figuring out where the stresses are. And I'll give you a hint. There's one that we know automatically. That one. Unbalanced or balanced. Why do we know that one? Well, because it's not balanced, right? We just know when a word has more than 1 syllable that there's a stress there. Okay, that's one. The rest of every other word here is a single syllable word, which makes it a little bit harder to know where the stresses are. That said, I think we all know that, life and death, these nouns, breath, mind, the verb, waste here, as well, and so on. Behind, obviously, because it has 2 syllables. Okay, and if we start filling in where there are no stresses, and now, of course, you can read these a little differently, but I'm just trying to flesh out the pattern quickly. Now, there's one tricky, so let me go to the second to last line here. A waste of breath, the years behind. This is a really regular line. There's kind of no other way to read this. It's a waste of breath, the years behind. So I'm going to write down now, I'm going to just show you. Now, poets don't do this, obviously. They don't write out numbers underneath their lines to make sure they get up to the right number of syllables, or they usually don't. Yeats is a completely brilliant metrist and prosodist. He's kind of the last hurrah of that whole tradition in some ways. So he doesn't need to do this. But why have I written this out here? I want you to see that wherever there's an even number, there's a stress. That's basically what makes this metrical. Now, in other lines, in balance with this life, the with doesn't have quite as much stress. So it's a little quieter in balance with this life, this death. So there's a little, if you can see here, we're over the 4th syllable. There's just a little twinge or a little subtlety there. Is this making sense so far? What questions are coming up for you, Tom?
Well, I guess one question I have is, it almost seems like that third line is it like gives you an indication of what the meter might be. Is that fair? So it's kind of easy to decode the third line and then you can apply it elsewhere?
Yeah, I think most poems in meter need to give you some clues here and there. If they're all really disruptive, then it's kind of hard to latch on to the meter, which is a thing that happens in poems if the poet wants you to struggle to catch hold of the meter, but not here. So I'm going to write another set of letters here. It's going to be a little confusing for a half second because the numbers are a little unhelpful in a way. Really, what we have are weak and strong positions. And wherever there's a strong position, you're likely to get a stress. And whenever there's a weak position, you probably shouldn't have one. Now, there are all sorts of, this is the most basic rule, and there's all sorts of ways in which poems do other things. But I would say, if you're looking at a poem and it's in this meter, it's got four primary stresses per line, see how many of the lines are kind of doing this roughly, and then look for places where they don't. And that'll give you the basic sense of the aesthetic form of the prosody. Now, there was kind of one rule. I'll give the one rule, which is that if you're really trying to hold on to this meter, you don't want to put a lot of these like mandatory stresses here into weak positions, because then you really start to mess with the meter. That gets a little more advanced, but that's the core of it. I want to show one more thing, because so there's meter in this poem. You can kind of see it now. It's pretty simple, but what is it? Why is it there? What does it mean at some level? How can we unite it? I've been saying it's kind of a version of Stoicism, but Yeats isn't just dropping in the meter. He's also connecting it with the syntax here, with the way he's connecting it with the order of thoughts and the breakdown. And so one thing you can see, it just turned it all red. Let's see. Well, I'll just do it in blue. So you can notice I balanced all. You see that right there? Brought all to mind. So notice that that's 4 syllables and that's 4. So that's balanced, right? He's splitting the line in half. Whenever you have 8 syllables, you can divide it in half and get 4 and 4. That's usually, if you don't divide it that way, it gets a little less, it gets a little more complex. The years to come seemed waste of breath, a waste of breath, the years behind. These very slight pauses, very slight here, are called caesura, and they're little pauses in the middle of the line. And here they're all balanced perfectly. Now, I'm just going to erase for a second so that you can see something. Okay. If you look at you might notice there's something kind of interesting going on in these second and third lines, right? There's a repetition. Do you see it?
No. Could you explain a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. Oh, it's doing this thing where it. Okay. So the years to come, we'll call that the A part. Seemed waste of breath. The B part, a waste of breath. Same thing, right? The years behind.
Yeah. So
that's that A-B-B-A structure is a more complex form of equation. We've got 4 parts, 4 syllable, 4 syllable, 4 syllables, 4 syllables. He's setting up this kind of larger, almost like sculpture. And there's this kind of crossing structure where you go from the A, the years to come, and the years behind. And in the middle is the sense of everything being a waste of breath. And so you've got this very regular meter setting up, it sets up the stage. It's kind of like the stone out of which he carves this sculpture. And that sculpture is the stoical image right there. It's like, it's not the years to come seem waste of breath, the years behind a waste of breath. It's just not as good.
Yeah.
I don't, he's created this more sophisticated antithesis between what is to come and what is behind. And it's kind of all living on top of the meter.
Yeah, so it seems like, as you say, the meter can be the foundation, and you can create more sophisticated, almost lyrical elements built out of it.
Right, and then the kind of coup de grace is at the very end of the poem. We get, a weak and a strong and a weak and a strong, and this life, this death. They're exactly balanced. They're put together syntactically in parallel, but they're also put together in parallel in that they each occupy one of these metrical feet. And so the meter here is doing the work of equating life and death. He's not just saying life and death are the same. The meter, the sound, the pattern is saying the same thing, and that's kind of what prosody is ultimately. I'm gonna close out of that share. I think ultimately that's what prosody is doing. It sets up parallels that set up equivalences or equations. They invite our brain to say, are these two things the same? Are they different? And they do it on a slightly like non-conceptual level, right?
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, that's a great example of meter. Now, I did want to, you've written a book on prosody, so I want to make sure we had a chance just to talk briefly about that. We have a few minutes left.
Okay.
So you have this book with Johns Hopkins University Press, published last year, Modernism's Metronome, Meter, and 20th-century Poetics. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. So I became very interested in what you might call the sort of twilight of meter. We still have it, but it came under a lot of pressure in the 1910s and 20s and 30s. And, most poetry we read now is kind of in free verse, or it's in some other form. We don't see as much meter now. And I'm not bemoaning that. I think it's just really interesting. It was really interesting to me to study this moment when a lot of great poets were writing both in meter and against meter. And so they really liked, you can see why Yeats found so much to do in that with meter in that poem. Yeah. But he, in a way, there's almost like an elegiac quality, like, oh, here's this meter, but it's not even what anyone is writing in anymore. And so I worked on poets like Robert Frost and T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, as well as several Harlem Renaissance poets, and just showed how important meter was to them and how they used it as a way to mark kind of the instability of their own art, right? They wanted to use this form, but it no longer had the same kind of street cred. Yeah. And so they kept writing it. So I wanted to really flesh that out for a period of about 3 or 4 decades.
Do you have the sense most poets from time to time return to meter? Is it seen as classic, safe, beautiful in its own right?
You talk to any poet and they'll tell you that they write in form and that they think about rhythm. But as for like actual meter, like we were just seeing in the Yeats poem, I'd say by the 60s and 70s, that was kind of the tail end of really obviously metrical poetry with some exceptions. You'll hear it because the language wants to do this kind of alternating thing, but I would say it'd be hard to really pinpoint really obviously metrical components of contemporary poetry. There's all sorts of rhythmic elements, of course, but it's a lot harder to study, actually. Yeah.
Well, we have just 2 minutes, so I'm curious. I think our viewers would be curious. What are you working on now? What's got you excited?
What's got me excited? Well, I keep trying to work on hip hop, but that's even harder because you actually have a musical beat and musical rhythm that you need to chart alongside the sort of virtuosic speech pattern. So you've got like a kind of counterpoint or interplay between an actual rhythm and in music, right, of drum machines and so on, and the voice. So, and rappers are always talking about their flow or their form. So I'd like to branch out into that. I'm interested in thinking about how we all learned or didn't learn to study meter. And so the next project will involve a lot of paying attention really more globally, not just in the US, to sort of how all of the ways in which we got trained to scan meter and study it kind of disseminated around the world and got taken up by poets in the mid-century and through towards the end of the 20th century in all sorts of different ways. So I'm interested in kind of the educational component. if we were in a classroom right now, I would really want to go around and kind of ask everyone, okay, how did you learn this? And people will often say, well, I took a Greek class, and so I learned some scansion in my classics because it's part of that, but it's really not so much a part of education in English now. And so
Well,
I'd like
it
to
seems
think
like
more.
one of those topics, Prosody, that you might not have heard of specifically or studied, but you encounter it all the time. And so I imagine once you introduce the concept, a student can come to mind with 3 or 4 examples quite easily.
All the time. Yeah.
Well, that's great. Well, Ben, thanks so much for joining us today. I enjoyed it. I learned a lot and I appreciate it.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.